travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I'm the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who thinks that the new Kineticist Playtest Class for Pathfinder 2e sounds really tough. Oh, I'm sorry, I always get that mixed up. It sounds like tough, you know what I'm saying? Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, I'm going to be doing a quick video on my initial thoughts about the Kineticist Playtest class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. For those of you who are not aware, one of the great things about Paizo as a company is that they like to do public playtests of new material for their games, and Pathfinder is no different. Usually every year we get at least one, if not more, playtest classes that the community gets to try out and give some public feedback on before Paizo releases the final design of the class. I really appreciate this about Paizo, and playtest time is here again in preparation for the book Rage of the Elements, which is scheduled to be released next summer. Paizo is giving us a chance to test out the Kineticist class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I will be throwing a link to the playtest document into the video description, and you can download that document entirely for free, use it at your Pathfinder 2e tables, and then go and give Paizo some feedback. I will also be including the feedback link as well. Paizo really likes to stress the idea of actual play testing. They want you to use this class, see how it functions at your table, and then let them know what works, what doesn't work, and what they might be able to change in order to make this class more enjoyable in its final form. You can see here that the playtest will run until September 5th, 2022, which means as of the time this video goes up, that there is less than a month to actually participate in the playtest. So this is the sort of thing where you're probably going to be doing a one-shot or maybe dropping a Kineticist in for a single session of your campaign, that kind of thing. Obviously, you can try it out at any level of play to see how it performs, but the important thing here is Paizo is giving us an opportunity to be part of the playtest development of the new Kineticist class. Now, allow me to say that this video today is my initial reaction to the Kineticist playtest. I have only read this document twice. I actually started a new job the day before I started recording this, and I was scratching out the notes for this video in between training videos for my new job, so this is very much a first reaction video. I'm not sure if I'm going to get a chance to do a deep playtest of the Kineticist, but if I get a chance to actually test it out in my home game, I will do a follow-up video to this one where I talk about my actual playtest experience. So this video is strictly, I have read through the playtest a couple of times, and I want to talk about some of the things that jump out. What are my thoughts? What are my initial reactions to the Kineticist class? Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, the Kineticist is a returning class from Pathfinder 1st Edition. In 1st Edition, there was a book called Occult Adventures, and the Kineticist was one of the classes that came from that book. And it specialized on different forms of, I guess you could say, psychokinetic, pyrokinesis, cryokinesis, different things like that, using their mind to manipulate the environment and basically just blasting people with elemental attacks. And if I'm being honest, Kineticist was just one of the classes in 1st Edition where my brain shut off. Like, I understand the appeal, and I know there were a lot of people who loved the 1st Edition Kineticist, but it was one of those classes that just never really sank in for me. It was towards the end of the edition, and it just, I don't know, I never really connected with the class, and it was a class that I just kind of swept to the side and ignored in my 1st Edition games. That being said, I was very interested when I heard that the Kineticist was going to be the playtest class for 2e, largely because I think the overall design concept of the Kineticist works better with the Pathfinder 2e action economy, and that was my mentality before I even read the playtest document. And if I'm being honest, in looking at the Kineticist playtest, I feel like that initial response on my part is probably pretty accurate. Overall, I am excited about the Kineticist. I know that as I dig in and really start to test out the class, I'm probably going to find things that need to be cleaned, need to be modified, need to be handled a little bit differently. I'm sure there's going to be pain points with this class, but just from a first edition to second edition design style, play style, the 2E Kineticist is already just fitting better as far as I'm concerned, and that in and of itself makes for a very positive change as far as I'm concerned. Some of the stuff feels generic but necessary, but I think a lot of the fun stuff, the flavorful stuff that you really can sink your teeth into, that's going to happen when you get into the specific elemental options. We're not going to be going over those in depth in this video, but if you want the fun reading, skip down to that section. Instead, what I want to do today is I want to talk about just 7 quick observations that I've had about the Kineticist and where I think the playtest might go as a result of the different decisions that Paizo has made. And the first one, probably the most important one in my book, you can actually see in the summary on the first page before you start reading any of the official class mechanics. This is a class for a player who wants to never worry about running out of spells to forge a connection with the primal elements of creation. And the word that I really love there is primal. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Paizo switched from having 2, then later 3 schools of magic. Originally in 1st Edition, it was Arcane, Divine, and Occult, but every spellcasting class kind of had its own take on those different spell lists. In 2nd Edition, Paizo switched from the 2, then 3 types of spells to 4 traditions of magic: Arcane, Divine, Occult, and Primal. Now, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, the Kineticist was explicitly part of the Occult Adventures book, meaning that the Kineticist was connected to occult magic. But occult magic in Pathfinder 2e really doesn't fit what the Kineticist is supposed to be. Occult magic in Pathfinder 2e is associated with mind and spirit essence. It's much more ephemeral. It doesn't have the raw physicality that you would associate with what the Kineticist class does. And so the smartest change that Paizo has made for the Kineticist, and one of the reasons that I am a fan of the playtest, is they just straight up made the Kineticist a primal class. Now, it's not a primal spellcaster. We'll talk about that. And the things that it does are associated with primal magic, and I think that's a much better thematic story fit for the class. But as we dive into the Kineticist class, the second thing that I want to talk about that I think is at least a very interesting development is the key ability for the Kineticist class. We're right here on the first mechanics page of the class, and you can see Constitution is the core ability for the Kineticist. There are no other classes in Pathfinder 2e that have Constitution as a key ability score, so this is already an extremely unique design decision. Now, this is a bit of a holdover from Pathfinder 1st Edition, and I'll go ahead and say that I am aware that there are a lot of debates, and some might even say full-scale arguments that are coming up around this, but let me just say that my initial response is at least, I'm interested. I want to see where this goes. Now, anytime you have what is essentially a martial class that doesn't have strength or dexterity as its key ability score, it is always a little bit controversial because it raises questions of how effective that class is going to be, and you have kind of the same problem here again. The Kineticist has a lot more in common with martial classes than you might initially think, and because it functions in many ways as a martial class, that means that strength or dexterity are going to be very important scores, and so pushing something that's not one of those two is a controversial choice. Now, that being said, there are classes like the Thaumaturge and the Investigator that have proven you can have an effective martial class that's not built around strength or dex, so it is possible to use an alternative ability score, but it does make it a little bit harder to pull off. Now, for me, part of the reason I'm excited about this is I've wanted to see Constitution as a key ability score for a while in Pathfinder 2e. I've wanted to know what that would look like for a class, and I will say, I think Kineticist is a good place to try this. And part of the reason is the Kineticist only uses light or unarmored defense. I would be worried about breaking the balance of the game if you were to stick Constitution as the key ability score on a class that had the ability to use heavy armor or that managed to get legendary defense. So I think if you want to use Constitution as a key ability score, you want to use it for a class like the Kineticist, where their regular defensive options are a little bit weaker, but they have that higher Constitution score, which offsets those weaker defenses. I think that this is a good balance. But overall, I don't think it's too bad. I feel like the Kineticist's role is pretty well defined. This is a combat-oriented class, and so you're going to have Constitution primary, and then Strength or Dex will be your second most important stat. And depending on how you want to play your character, it should be pretty obvious. So I don't think most players will have too much trouble building a Kineticist. And I do think Constitution as a key ability score fits neatly with the different build concepts that a Kineticist might have. So overall, I'm at least interested in what Paizo is doing here. But that all leads me to point number 3 for this video, which is the Kineticist is, as I mentioned, a combat-oriented class. And when I read through the Kineticist, there is one class that the Kineticist really reminds me of, and that is the Fighter. Over here, you can see an ability that the Kineticist will get at 9th level called Elemental Flexibility, and there's an improved version later on down the road. What these do is these allow the Kineticist to essentially gain an extra class feat that they can switch out every day. On top of this, there's an ability called your Inner Gate. We'll discuss that when we get to subclasses later. And your Inner Gate also gives you some bonus class abilities in the form of impulse feats, and essentially those you have the ability to switch out as well. And these remind me of an often overlooked feature of the fighter class, combat flexibility. The fighter has the ability to adjust their class feats every day based on what they think they're going to need. Now, most people who talk about fighters focus on the fact that fighters can get up to legendary proficiency with weapons, and that's a pretty big deal. But one of my favorite things about fighters is that element of flexibility, the ability to adjust their tactics based on what they think they're going to need. And seeing a similar ability, elemental flexibility, combat flexibility, Paizo's not swinging for the bleachers on new names here. It's a very similar concept between the two classes, and I like the idea that the Kineticist gets the ability to really adjust what they want to do, how they want to use their powers. I think it's fun, I think it's flavorful, and I'm very happy to see one of my favorite parts of the fighter class being applied to the Kineticist. But this brings me to point number 4. If we're going to be comparing the Kineticist to the fighter or other martial-oriented classes like the monk or the ranger, I do think it's important to recognize that this class is going to occupy a niche that is very solidly in the combat side of the scale. The Kineticist has a few abilities that can play into a social game or scenario, or could apply to exploration mode. The Kineticist is not completely dependent on combat abilities alone, but much like the fighter, when you look at the Kineticist, you will quickly realize that a lot of their abilities really push them towards utility in combat, and if you're looking for a heavy roleplay or heavy skill class, this is probably not going to be the class for you. In other words, the Kineticist is not going to mirror the rogue in a lot of ways. If you need a good example of this, over here you have the key terms for the Kineticist class. You have impulses, which are different magical abilities that come from gathering the elements. You also have kinetic auras, which can protect you or harm people around you. There are abilities with the Overflow trait, which expressly expend all of your gathered elemental energy dealing a lot of extra damage, but requiring you to gather more elements back to yourself before you can use your Kineticist abilities again. And you can even see in this list that some Kineticist abilities are going to reference the Brutal trait. It's not specific to Kineticist, but it's common enough that they're like, hey, we should go ahead and give you this effect so you know what it means. If you take all of these things together, you end up with a class that is very much contingent on its role in combat, and I think that's where a lot of the engagement, a lot of the excitement is going to be. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? It's going to depend on your playstyle, but I do think you should be aware if you're going to try out the Kineticist, it's definitely a combat-oriented option. Now, in there, I've mentioned a couple of abilities that you need to understand if you want to play a Kineticist, and kind of the core abilities for the Kineticist are Gather Element and Elemental Blast. These are both single action activities, and you can see that essentially Gather Element allows you to gather a particular element to yourself, and then Elemental Blast allows you to attack out with that element in some fashion. It's worth noting that there are both melee and ranged options with your Elemental Blast, and you can use Elemental Blast over and over again once you have successfully gathered an element. So you can almost think of Gather Element as drawing a weapon and then Elemental Blast as using that weapon. So there's a little bit of action cost to it, but it's not super complicated. I think it's fairly easy to track. But then, as I mentioned, you also have the Overflow trait. Aerial Boomerang is an example of a class feat that has the Overflow trait, and it comes from the air options for the Kineticist class. That essentially gives the Kineticist a special ability that they can use, but once they use that special ability, the element that they've gathered to themselves has been expended, and they have to spend another action in order to gather elements again. Point number 5 for this video is simply this. Overflow is a new mechanic that has replaced the first edition mechanic of Burn, and personally, I love this. Burn is one of the big reasons that the first edition Kineticist just never saw any play at my table. I was never interested enough in the class to want to put up with trying to understand the Burn rules. It was just too much homework for too little reward as far as I was concerned. The gather elements, blast, and overflow concept for the 2E Kineticist, much simpler, much easier to use, and I think the reward versus the amount of homework you have to do, I think it fits a lot better, and so I think overflow is a much better mechanic than burn was, and I am happy to see that in this version of the class. Point number 6 for this video is kind of a repeat of what I said earlier, but I will say this, Paizo has done a good job of at least making fun concepts for the 2E Kineticist. A lot of their abilities are entertaining. Now, I'm not going to dive into all of the specific elemental options that are further down in this playtest document, but I will show you 3 abilities that I think are good examples of this. The first one is Adapt Element, which allows you to do simple tricks with the element of your choice. You can gather it, move it, regulate it, sculpt it, things like that. You also get at 3rd level an ability called Elemental Resistance, where as long as you have gathered an element, you gain resistance to any source of damage that has that elemental trait. But far and away one of my favorite things in this class, it's one of the best abilities that Paizo gave them, is the 3rd level ability Extract Element. Extract Element is a single action activity that targets a creature with an elemental nature and literally attempts to rip some of that element out of them. So if you're dealing with a fire elemental, you can actually pull some of the fire out of that creature and gather that element to yourself to then turn around and use. And the cool part of this is when you use elements gathered from a creature, you can damage creatures with that element even if they would otherwise be immune. So if I extract fire from a fire elemental, I can then blast it with its own fire and potentially damage the creature. And that, I think, is both, number one, super flavorful, And number 2, prevents the class from being unintentionally hamstrung if it fights certain creatures. So overall, the Playtest Kineticist has a ton of fun abilities, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm looking forward to. I think Paizo did a good job of at least bringing the flavor on this class. But this brings us to the last point I want to talk about, and that is the inner gate and channeled element or elements associated with a given kineticist. This is essentially the defining subclass of the kineticist, and you have 3 options. You can have a dedicated gate where you are connected to a single element but gain extra abilities because of your devotion to that element. You can have a dual gate that connects to 2 elements and gives you slightly less options, but you get to pick options from both of the elements you're connected to. Or you can have a universal gate that connects to all elements but gives you the least number of bonus options on a given day. If you choose the universal gate, you can access all of the elemental planes and potentially use any element as a kineticist, and every day when you make your daily preparations, you can gain a single first level impulse feat that you can use until your next daily preparations. The dual gate only gives you access to 2 elements. You do get to choose which 2 they are, but you get 2 first level impulse feats, though one must be from one element and the other must be from the other element that you have chosen. Finally, you have the dedicated gate where you pick a single element, and while you're limited to only that element, you do get 3 first level impulse feats every day that you can freely use along with your other powers. Now for the playtest, they give us air, earth, fire, and water, and they've already noted that wood and metal will be added to the final version of the class, and possibly even some hybrid elements as well. When it comes to the inner gate, the channeled elements, and the choices for those, I'm gonna admit this doesn't feel right to me, but I don't know why. This is one of those areas where I really want to get in and do some playtesting because for some reason I just have alarms going off in my head saying that dedicated gate, dual gate, and universal gate are not balanced against one another. I've read through the rules and I can't find a specific thing where I'm just like, oh, this is off or that's off. They give good options for all 3, and it seems like they should be reasonably structured against each other, but for some reason this is an element of the class design that just isn't sitting well with me, though I cannot put into words why, at least not yet. Now when I get some playtest time in, maybe I will discover some elements of the game design that aren't fitting well, or maybe I will become more comfortable with this particular game design. I don't know where I'm going to end up on this, but I will admit for some reason, at this point, this is one aspect of the kineticist that I am uncomfortable with. So we'll see how that goes. But that's all I've got for you today. These are just my initial thoughts on the playtest kineticist. I've read through the class twice. I have not had a chance to actually use this in play. So I'm sure that my opinion will change as the playtest goes along, and I do hope to get at least a good one shot with this in. If I can get some real playtime in, I will do a follow-up video and talk in more detail about how that playtest goes. But for now, let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about the 2E playtest for the Kineticist? Jump down into the comments section and let me know. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to do all the YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe. Check out my free Discord, my Patreon. Both of those will be linked in the video description. I do know that I originally was hoping to have my classic introduction video for the Psychic up this week. So hopefully I'll see you next week with a video on the Psychic class. Until then, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.